As we are dismissing our kids at Children's Church, turn to the book of Nehemiah in your Bibles, and we're going to look at some things in the book of Nehemiah relative to living large. We talked to you last week a little bit about the power of a compelling vision, looking at the life of Moses, and introduced the thought of a holy discontent. I want to build on that a little bit this week and talk to you about dealing with your holy discontent. Watch this video with me for just a moment.
The day I found out that the walls in Jerusalem, my hometown, had been destroyed, I wept. Why? I asked God. My people tried to be good people. We made some mistakes, left God out of the equation sometimes, but surely we didn't deserve such destruction. I still don't understand it, to be honest, but one thing I felt certain of, I needed to help rebuild. It was as if it was my God-ordained mission, and I couldn't ignore the calling.
Fortunately, Nehemiah was working for the king at the time, and the king trusted him. Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem with the king's blessing, as well as building materials for his massive construction project.
Gather round, everyone. I don't think I have to tell any of you how bad things are. You all have eyes, you can see the destruction. And while this probably sounds crazy, I'm here to help with rebuilding. God has called me to this task, but really, He's called all of us to it.
Inspired by Nehemiah's faith, the people were willing to help, and they all set to work. Not everyone, however, was encouraged by Nehemiah's devotion. 3 punks from rival communities were less than pleased with Nehemiah's plans.
Who does this Weasley Nehemiah think he is, swooping in to save the day? Does he honestly think he can bring these knuckleheads together to rebuild this massive wall?
God-ordained mission, my foot. Someone has a serious hero complex going on.
Look, I don't care about his alleged divine mission. All I know is we gotta put a stop to it.
As the people of Jerusalem worked to rebuild the wall, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem began plotting their demise. First, they tried intimidating the Jews.
You call that a wall?
If that's the wall your God has inspired, well, I've got some questions about your God.
Nehemiah, your wall is so weak, it'll crumble the first time someone sneezes.
But Nehemiah and the Jews were unimpressed. They continued building, which only enraged the punks further.
Okay. So mockery didn't work. What's next?
We gotta attack.
When they least expect it, we'll surround them with our armies. They'll be so surprised they won't know what to do. The wall will be back in ruins in no time.
These threats were a bit more effective. The people were getting nervous.
Nehemiah, we're doing everything we can here, but the enemies are closing in.
I'm starting to think this was a bad idea.
Pretty sure I agree to build a wall, not get attacked by a bunch of bullies.
But Nehemiah, who had been praying all along, continued to trust God.
Look, I know this is scary.
You think?
But we've come this far, we can't give up now. God hasn't given up on us. I'm sure of it. Trust my prayers. Trust your prayers. Our faith and love is greater than the threats of our enemies.
I want to believe the guy, but...
Shh! Listen!
Here's what we're going to do. Each day, I want half of the crew to build while the other half stands guard. And even when you're building, keep one hand on your tools and keep your sword in your other hand. The trumpet is the warning. If it sounds, stop building and join the fight.
But even the Jews' preparedness didn't stop the 3 punks from cooking up yet another scheme. They've sent Nehemiah a note.
Nehemiah, old pal, we got off on the wrong foot. Let's start over. Meet us a no-no?
Nehemiah didn't buy it. His response was simple.
Nope, working on awesome wall. No time. Sorry.
When their outright attacks failed, they went for trickery. This time, they sent an anonymous note to Nehemiah.
Yo, Maya, someone told me that you and the other Jews are rebuilding the wall and plan to rebel. Something about you wanting to be king? The Persian king is so not going to be down with that. Let's chat.
But Nehemiah, still praying diligently, was once again onto their plot. He responded,
LOL, no way.
While there were more plots, Nehemiah saw through every one. His faithful prayers protected him, the project, and his people.
We did it! Our God is great!
In spite of the threats, the opposition, and the magnitude of the project, the wall was completed, and thousands of exiled Jews returned to Jerusalem.
That will save us from reading 6 chapters, so I thought we might do it that way. And you did realize that your Bible said Nehemiah, right? Anyhow, I want to look at the life of Nehemiah with you this morning. And as we kind of gather around God's Word, would you bow with me again? Father, we're so thankful for these stories that encourage our hearts. And Lord, it's more than just about building a wall or rebuilding the temple. Father, in essence, it's about rebuilding a way of life. And Lord, I pray that you would speak to our hearts, God, however you should see fit, because I know that there is in every heart a holy discontent. And so I pray that you would help us to be able to identify what it is that you are trying to accomplish through that. And Lord, that somehow collectively we might be able to put our shoulder to the plow for your greater glory and your honor, that the kingdom of God might be enlarged. Now, Lord, I am not unaware, Lord, that our kids are away today, and Lord, that our worship leader just returned from a retreat, and we have other families who are on the move. And Lord, I just pray that you would be with us today. Because Lord, unless you move, unless you inhabit the words that I speak, we're wasting our time. So Lord, I just pray that you would inhabit a smaller crowd, but willing to hear your voice. And so I pray, oh God, that you would work within us, through us, that we hear your voice today. In Jesus' name. So what do you do with Nehemiah? I think, first of all, you have to locate him historically. And the video was helpful in doing some of that. And so let me just retrace that a little bit with you. We're thinking now in terms of history of that period of time after the southern kingdom has fallen, also known as Judah. Although it was really Judah and Benjamin. The southern kingdom was last to fall. You may recall that after the time of Solomon, the kingdom was divided into north and south. The 10 tribes to the north swiftly fell to the Assyrians, and Judah held out longer. Partially because in Judah was Jerusalem. And the people of God thought that there was no way on God's green earth that God is going to let his temple fall into pagan hands. But Jeremiah and Isaiah and other prophets were systematically dispelling that idea, made them very unpopular, because the Israelites just firmly believed that God wasn't going to destroy his own house. And Judah did, however, fall. Not to the Assyrians, they fell to the Babylonians. And they were taken into exile. One thing that we have difficulty appreciating, I think, is the extent to which an opposing king would destroy an opposing nation. Nowadays, we do that from afar. We can do that with a push of a button here, and we can see the results on TV and never physically even go there. But in those days, it was important for an opposing king not just to take a city and to destroy a king's army, but to decimate and subjugate a people. Because what they literally did was they would enslave as many of them as possible. In fact, many of them would be inducted into their way of life. Hence, you have the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You have the story of Daniel. They were the finest that were taken over into Babylon, indoctrinated in the hopes that they would become a part of the part and parcel of the Babylonian way of life and their value system. And so that was the way things were done. And in order for that to happen, there was a lot of hands-on. There was tearing down the walls, tearing down the city, why take down the temple? Because it represented a way of life. So they destroyed everything, they decimated the people, they left a handful of people there, ones that weren't considered to be a threat, and they typically would continued to live their lives among the ruins, trying to rebuild their lives, sometimes with some oversight, a lot of times with no oversight. And many of the ones that remained began intermarrying into the surrounding cultures. And so you had kind of you had Jews that had a Jewish origin or ethnicity, but blended families. So later this gives rise to the conflict between Samaritans and Jews, because some of the Jewish exiles had maintained their historical and ethnical purity and others had not. And so you kind of had this conflict going on between Samaritans and Jews. Now, and after this had gone on for a while, the people are in exile. In 539, King Cyrus, who's a Persian king, he defeats the Babylonians. He's hailed as liberator. In fact, you'll even read that as you read some of the major prophets. They looked at him as the servant of God who was performing God's work in liberating the people. 539 BC, this happens. A year later, in 538, Zerubbabel and Joshua get permission to rebuild the temple. So they hasten back to rebuild the temple ruins and to do their best to institute again what was the heart of Jewish culture, and that was the worship of Yahweh and the sacrificial system and so on. The problem is that they didn't quite complete the work. So the temple work began and then just kind of languished. In fact, it isn't until Haggai and Zechariah and some of the other prophets encouraged them to finish what they started. It's down, the clock winds down to 520 to 515 BC, the work is undertaken again, and this time it's completed. In 458, priest Ezra is granted permission to enforce the book of the law. He has the king's blessing, and he's supposed to go and allow the book of the law, the Torah, God's commandments, to be taught. However, when Ezra oversees the circumstances, he realizes rather quickly that it's one thing to build and dedicate a temple, it's another to allow that to be open and exposed to just about everyone who wanted to walk through the city gates. Ezra's heart was to get back to being what it meant to be the people of God. To do that, you had to build the city walls, to preserve the temple, and in doing so, preserve a way of life from the infiltration of other cultures. Well, Ezra had been given permission to rebuild the temple. He hadn't been given permission to rebuild the walls. So when the king finds out that he is rebuilding the walls, the Persian king is unhappy and sends a delegation to undo what Ezra did, tears the walls down again. And so they stayed that way for a number of years until enter Nehemiah, circa 446 BC. He receives news of the deplorable conditions in Jerusalem. That's Nehemiah historically. Personally, we know that Nehemiah is cupbearer to the king. There's some who even see some connection to Esther, but Nehemiah is cupbearer to the king for our purposes today, which means that he was trusted. A cupbearer was trusted because he served as the king's personal canary. In other words, before a king tasted the wine, the cupbearer tasted it because somebody was trying to kill the king by way of poisoning his drink. Nehemiah would be the first to fall. He was the secret service of that day, if you will. Nehemiah was trusted that much, cupbearer to the king. And so that's Nehemiah. Now, as we think about Nehemiah, we see a lot of similarities to the life of Moses. First thing I want you to think about with me this morning as we think about dealing with a holy discontent. Last week we made the point that holy discontents often come from God. That is a trust, a sacred trust that He gives you because His heart aches over something. And when your heart begins to ache over what God's heart aches about, heaven touches earth and God wants to do a work in that. So we see that in the life of Moses. And we see that here in the life of Nehemiah. First thing you have to remember is that you have to inform your holy discontent. Knowledge is power. Moses and Nehemiah have this in common. It's interesting that neither of them had to make themselves uncomfortable. They really didn't have to. Aside from the holy unction that was upon them, there was no outside force that was forcing Moses to get involved here. He could have stayed in Pharaoh's courts as long as he wanted to, and Pharaoh would have loved him and blessed him and used him, and he would never have had to go out to the backside of the wilderness of some jerkwater town and tend flocks out there. He would never have to do that. But he did, because he had a holy discontent to which he was faithful. And Nehemiah also had a holy discontent. And he could have also stayed in the king's court. Man, unless somebody was trying to take out the Persian king, he had it good. You know, a bottle of unfortunately, you know, having the misfortune of drinking poisoned wine could have ended his life, but otherwise he had it pretty good. Sampled some of the finest food available to man in that day, and living in that posh environment that suggested that the cupbearer usually had other responsibilities delegated to him. So, man, he was, as far as the king's court was concerned, he had it well. But he chose instead to feed his holy discontent. And because Moses and Nehemiah both decided to do that, they made a difference. I want you to know today that there is a power in pain. Pain has power to motivate. The problem with that in our culture is that we are pain averse. We are the most anesthetized community or people on the face of the earth. If you don't believe that, then just check out, Google sometime, how many billions of dollars are spent on pain relievers in the U.S. alone. Because we want to get rid of the headache, and we want to get rid of the backache, and we want to get rid of, you know, the joints that hurt and the feet that hurt at the end of the day. And so all kinds of stuff. I love the commercials, don't you? You can take the pill, and it'll help your ankle, which is hurting you. It'll take out your liver, your heart, your kidneys, your spine, 16 other things. But your ankles won't hurt anymore. That's probably because you will have died in your ankle. You don't feel your ankles anymore. But we have all kinds of ways to insulate us from anything uncomfortable. Think about the way we live our lives, the ads that sell automobiles. All the comforts of home at the touch of a button. You can turn your car on before you get to it. I mean, how lazy are we getting? You know, turn it on. Oh, I didn't mean you, Bud. Bud has a sweet truck, and his does that. But you know, the technology is getting so good that you can, before you get home, you know, you can turn your lights on at home. You can turn your stereo on. You can have things ready so that you can turn your air down, so that when you come home, you can kick off your shoes and you're instantly comfortable. We are insulating ourselves from anything that will make us even slightly uncomfortable. It might be okay. As far as our culture goes, spiritually it will kill you. It will absolutely kill you. Because pain is a gift. In fact, there's a doctor who wrote about the gift of pain. It's the body's way of telling you, hello, something's not right. Your joints ache for a reason. Your headache is for a reason. There's things happening in your body, and the way that your body tells you is to jab you a little bit with some pain, and you pay attention. Pain is a gift. Apart from pain, we perish. I'll never forget reading some of the stories associated with the atrocities and the horror of leprosy. When there were leper colonies, and you know, there were folks who the outer layer of their skin was just falling and rotting away. Stench was unbearable. Living that life in Jesus' day, the lepers were ostracized and kept away. They had to ring a bell, announce their presence, because people were deathly afraid of it, didn't want to deal with it. But a leper doesn't have, the nerve endings begin to die, doesn't have a sense of pain. So I've read stories where a leper was standing up against something hot, didn't even know it. It's searing the skin. You can smell the stench of burnt skin. They don't know they're on fire. Pain is a gift. It puts you in touch with what God is wanting to do in your life. There's power in that. So Nehemiah chose not to take the pill, and decided to take a look at what was going on. Well, notice verse 4, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. He embraced the pain. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Notice in chapter 2, when he goes into the king's presence, he doesn't take great pains to disguise the way that he's feeling. And typically, kings like to be up. And so if you're a bummer, they don't want you around. Sometimes it could cost you your life. And so Nehemiah goes into the king's presence with all of this on his heart. And the king notices, and he says to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" He shares with him what's on his heart. Notice what happens when Nehemiah finally gets permission to go. He takes a delegation and he goes, and what does he do? Chapter 2, verse 13, "By night I went out to the valley gate toward the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem." He's taking a close look. He's informing himself. They had been broken down and their gates had been destroyed by fire. He wanted to see it. He wanted to see it. He wanted to experience that. He wanted to embrace that. He wanted to know how bad it was. He wasn't just going to take somebody's word for it. He had to see that firsthand. And when God gives us a holy discontent, whatever that may be, look at it. Don't ignore it. Don't push it aside. Don't gloss it over as though it's no big thing. Look at it. Because that's what hurts the heart of God. I heard a story about Bob Pierce, who I think it's Feed the Children, who is, had a heart to deal with the hungry kids in other parts of the world. And Bill Hybels was sharing a little bit about how he got involved in the fray. And it was because one day he paid a visit and he saw that in the food lines the kids are just falling out. And some of them are unconscious because they're just too weak to stand, and some of them died that way. And when he asked as to why the lines and why are they dying in line, he said there's no food at the head of the line. That it ignited a firestorm in his heart, and he did everything within his power to change that reality so that there would be food at the head of the line. And a ministry was born, a global entity that stewards hundreds of thousands of dollars every year to alleviate that particular need. You can't insulate yourself from it. And I know that we can't have 1,000 holy discontents. What I'm encouraging you to do through this series is to get in touch with the one that you have. And maybe you have 2 or 3 that are connected, but what is it that absolutely drives you crazy and you just can't stand it, and you get the feeling that God isn't liking it either? Because if the 2 of you stand in agreement, heaven touches earth. What causes you pain? For Nehemiah, it was broken things and broken people. He couldn't stand it that the walls were broken down. Couldn't stand it that the people were put together around the things that once held them together as a holy people of God, as a sacred kingdom, as people living for Yahweh. It just absolutely ruined him that the things that would preserve a way of life had been broken down, and the people along with it had been broken down. And his holy discontent took shape with regard to the things that were dysfunctional about his people. What is it that wrecks you? I want you to chase that. Don't run from that question. What wrecks you? Is it young people that don't know the Lord? Is it young adults? Is it the struggle of young families trying to raise kids who might not know the Lord? I told you about mine, the empty pews, the empty chairs. Is it when things don't work right? Some folks that are wired with technical stuff, they can't stand it when stuff don't work right. They want things to work. And I'm not a techie, but when my phone doesn't work, I want to throw it across the room. I'm not sure what that is. Still working on it. But we want things to work. There's a beauty in having things work. God is a God of order. A God who takes the chaos that we read about in Genesis 1 and calls it into order day by day with a commanding word of creation, one after another. He calls this universe to order, and he wants to continue to do that. You see, when the enemy came, he created disorder. And God is continuing to call the world back to a place of order. And He calls us to join Him in bringing order to lives that are fractured and broken and dysfunctional and not working. There He wants to glorify God.
That's right.
He calls the church to do that along with Him. So inform your holy discontent. Know the number. Know the extent. Know what's going on. And embrace that pain. Let it touch your life so that you can in turn partner with God to touch other lives. Also, I want you to realize that you have to invest your holy discontent. Inform your holy discontent. Invest your holy discontent. In Nehemiah's example, we see him investing his holy discontent. You see, you typically with a holy discontent, you have three options. You can kill it, and a lot of us just like to ignore it, and let's get on to happier things. I don't want to talk about that anymore because it upsets me. You heard that, right? So we can kill it through neglecting it and covering it up with all kinds of other stuff, getting on to other things and happier thoughts. We can kill it, or we can let it kill you. In other words, you inform yourself and you just let it eat you up and you don't do anything about it. It'll kill you. Or you can invest it. You can take what God is doing in your heart and you can channel that into meaningful activity for the glory of God. Again, thinking about last week, the fact that when God moves, often He moves through human agency. It's divine action often channeled through human agency. Why? We weren't on the scene when God created the universe. He didn't need us one bit. And this ought to stop you in your tracks for a moment when you realize that God has chosen to work through human agency. Has chosen, has called you. He saves you, He sanctifies you, He fills you, and then He releases you to serve because He wants to make a difference in your life and through your life. And to me, that's awesome to live in that recognition, to realize that, God doesn't have another plan. There isn't plan C, D, and E. It's the church and God's people. He entrusted the faith to them, and He says, now go change the world. Amen. He calls us to do that. So we invest our holy discontent. I want you to see in Nehemiah's story the power of planning. 5 things under that. First of all, prayer. We have to begin with prayer. Isn't it interesting that as Nehemiah is weeping and as he is thinking about what he had just heard and he can't believe it and he's disgusted and busted and what's he do with that? He starts praying. Almost immediately, chapter 1, you're not even 5 verses in, he's praying. I love it. Because that's where we begin. That's where we begin. We begin with the power of prayer. He prays, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps His covenant of love with those who love Him and keep His commandments. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant who is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. By the way, he launches into a very lengthy confession at that point. One thing that our friendly little video glossed over. Did you catch that in the beginning? Lord, we've made some mistakes. Really? You forsook the Lord your God and turned to idolatry. That's more than a little mistake. It's the sin, by the way, of our country. That's why it's important for us to pray for our nation, lest we be decimated at the hands of others. I'm telling you. So prayer, he's praying. And Nehemiah, interestingly enough, is written a lot like a memoir. He's telling a story. And he inflects personal notes throughout it. In fact, Ezra and Nehemiah were actually thought to be a part of one work originally. And so if you read it in the Septuagint, it will be called Second Ezra. If you read it in the Apocrypha, it too has a designation that would indicate that it's a continuing piece of the Ezra component. Now, I say this because he's sharing his own personal story of how God has worked in and through him, and prayer is woven throughout the story. It was accentuated in the video that you saw. Every time they're mocked, every time they're ridiculed, every time there's a setback, every time there's opposition, every time there's a new threat, Nehemiah don't play, he just goes to the Lord and pray. I love that about Nehemiah. Nehemiah's prayers are interspersed with regularity. And I'll give you just a couple of examples of chapter 2, verse 4, chapter 4, verse 4, chapter 5, verse 19. In chapter 13, you get a picture of how he kind of, this is a personal memoir, and he's just kind of talking to the Lord even as he's living his life out. I love the way this reads. In verse 14 of chapter 13, he says, "Remember me, Lord, for this, O my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services." And then in verse 22, he says this, he says, "Remember me for this also, O Lord," for reinstituting the fact that they needed to worship on the Sabbath. "Oh my God, show mercy to me according to your great love." So he acts and then he says, "Lord, remember that. Remember that. Don't forget that. Remember me kindly for doing that, for the passion that I have for your people, the zeal that I have for your house, the love I have for you. Don't forget that, Lord." And so it's the personal, very personal and transparent story of a guy who understood that if you're going to plan to do anything about your holy discontent, then you have to go, as we learned, if you went to the war room movie, you got to go to the war room. You got to spend some time on your face with the one who had the holy discontent long before he shared it with you, and wants to do something through you for the glory of God. The second thing is provision. Provision. When you plan, you need God to provide some things. And God did in this story. In verse 8 of chapter 2, we read that God provided, and if you read the story later at home or whenever, or you're well familiar with it, you know that he was given not only authority, but all kinds of stuff to get the work done. All kinds of timber, all kinds of stuff. Go, be blessed, go do it. Because of the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted all my requests. Now, don't miss this. Don't miss this. The king, it's the same king who had resisted previous attempts to rebuild the wall. It's the same guy that when Ezra had overstepped his bounds and didn't just go build the temple, but started building the walls, he came and tore them down again. So here's Nehemiah, who on the heels of that, some years have gone by, but who after that now is going to go and undertake that again. Do you realize what's at stake here? First of all, the king has already demonstrated with his actions that he's unwilling to do that. Second of all, Nehemiah is putting himself personally on the line, because if he falls out of favor with the king, he's done. He's not cupbearer, he's out of the king's court, might even cost him his life. But he's willing to take that risk. When it comes to provision, we have to trust God, yes. But the tendency that we have to do, the tendency that we have as humans is to trust God and wait. I'm going to sit now. There's a place for waiting. I'm not saying that. But sometimes the inactivity of saints absolutely blows my mind. Because we're to trust God and to do works that are filled with faith. That's why James tells the church that faith and works go together. When it comes to your salvation, you trust the Lord. But what happens after salvation? Works of righteousness, right? You don't just go sit down in your easy boy and get the remote, and that's how you live out until God calls you into the sweet by and by. It's a tandem expression of faith first, but works go together with that. And so as we think about faith, trust God and be willing, for crying out loud, to take some risk once in a while. We cannot always play it safe. We cannot always wait. There are times that we need to press ahead and trust God to do that. And if you follow the pages of Scripture, you see that God time and again would test his people that way. Nehemiah trusted God, but he took a risk. And if you read the story, right before, the king says to him, "What is it you want?" Chapter 2, verse 4. He says, "Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king." He's praying as he's talking. "Oh Lord, help me say it well. Grant me favor, God. Grant me grace. I'm way out here on this limb. It's bending. I hear it bending. Creaking in the wind. Help me, Lord." Don't just trust and sit. Trust and risk something for the glory of God. I've often thought that a lot of our blessings are forfeited because we don't risk anything. If you don't risk anything, what does God respond to? When you step out in faith, when you have a guy like Gideon, whose army is pared down to 300, and he still puts himself out there, That's trust and obey. For there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. Trust and risk something. Partnership also all over the story. I said to them, you see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, he says, let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and we will no longer be in disgrace. And they replied, let us start rebuilding. And so they began this good work. I love this story. I love this story because he partners. When God calls you into a holy discontent, you're not the only person on the planet that has ever had that thought. We like to think of that, don't we? As though, God is talking often to other people. And I love it when it happens in the church. You get together in a meeting, and all of a sudden you have kindred minds and spirits because the Spirit of God has been talking to the other members of the committee long before the gavel drops and you start your meeting. It's God working in the hearts of His people. Other people have noticed the problem. Other people had noticed. Other people had a discontent. Other people, and He says, come and let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. And they replied, let's go. We're willing. Let's go. God will surround you not only with resources in terms of provision, but in terms of people. Notice protection is a part of this too. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. And if you're following the story, I know we're just skipping over a bunch of verses, but remember the concise video you saw, all of the different things that the enemies were trying to do to dissuade them, mockery and threats and ridicule and all of that. And so he says, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. And wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. Our God will fight for us. Did you see again how faith and works go together? In that same sentence, preceding sentence, he says, fight for your families, verse 14. Fight for your families, your sons and your daughters. Fight for your wives and your homes. And then 6 verses later, he says, whenever you hear the trumpet, join us there because our God will fight for us. He is fighting with you. He is fighting for you, but not apart from you. And invites you to pick up your sword, pick up the armor of God, join Him in the fray, do something for the glory of God. There's a whole lot that can be said about this. We are called upon to fight for those things that God has entrusted to our care. And the best way we can fight is on our knees. And so we pray, Lord, protect those that you've entrusted to my care. I pray for my family. I pray for my sons, my daughters. I pray for my wife and my loved ones. And I pray, God, for the folks in this church that you have entrusted to my stewardship as shepherd. Lord, protect and preserve. You have to fight for those that you love. The best way to do that is on your knees. And there's a little perseverance. Planning includes not only prayer and provision and partnership. You need other resources besides things. You need people. There's also divine protection, but there's also perseverance. So the wall was completed, we read in chapter 6, on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. What an amazing undertaking. And when all of our enemies heard about this and all the surrounding nations saw it, our enemies lost their self-confidence, sucked the wind right out of their sails, because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. God-sized tasks that require God-sized risks and God-sized faith and God-sized actions, but see it through. Don't quit on God, He won't quit on you. See it through. So the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. A lot of holy discontents die because they might get well into the planning stage. They're praying and they're partnering and God's providing, and they don't see it through. I'll pray to perhaps the ridicule of the enemy. You're not going to get this done. Come on, be real. You're going to be the laughing stock of everybody. Get your head out of the sand. What's wrong? Or because you have some real threats to your safety. Maybe it's your name that's on the line. Maybe it's your resources on the line. Maybe it's your family on the line. And you're not willing to take the risk. See it through. Persevere. And God will honor that. So invest your holy discontent and invite others, is the third point, invite others into your holy discontent. Kind of covered a little bit under the partnership thought, but want you to see that a little more fully now. The power of proximity is all over the story. In Nehemiah 3, he begins describing how they were going about the work. Eliashib, the high priest, and his fellow priests went to work, and they rebuilt the sheep gate. That's a good start. But if you read that verse carefully, you begin to see that Eliashib, the high priest, and the fellow priests, they're working together. They went to work together, and they rebuilt the sheep gate. You won't see the words better together, but it's all over the story. And so you have in verse 2 the word adjoining. That one person was working on a part that adjoined another person's work. In verse 10, somebody was working opposite where somebody else was doing some work. Verse 17, beside somebody else who was working. Verse 28, in front of where others were working. And then the phrase next to is used in verse 2, 4, 7, 10, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 27, 29, 30, 31. Is the phrase next to. Next to him was this guy, next to him that guy, next to him that guy. Even the ladies worked. One guy put his daughters to work, working on the wall. No age restriction, no gender discrimination. Everybody was adjoining or opposite or beside or front and next to. In other words, it took everybody doing their part, pitching in, because we can do more things together and better together. Together we can make a difference. And so they lived their life in that sense of community. Invite others into your holy discontent. Don't try to do it all yourself. Don't try to be the hero. God is calling you to be the hero. He's calling you to be faithful. But you take and steward what He's given you in terms of a holy discontent. You trust Him with it. You invest it and invite others into your holy discontent, adjoining, opposite, beside, and front. And God will do a great work. In 52 days, the wall was done. Intimidation cannot extinguish a holy discontent. You know why? Because it's driven by the power of purpose. Notice Nehemiah 4:6, we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half of its height, for the people worked with all of their heart. I love that. With all of their heart, they're working. They're ignoring the threats because in their mind's eye they had seen the glory and the importance of a rebuilt wall, which will not only serve as an edifice to their honor, but would actually preserve a way of life. I'm telling you, in our country, the walls, we don't have a wall surrounding our country, but metaphorically we do. The walls have been breached, they're falling down. If you look closely enough, it'll cause you to weep, just like Nehemiah wept, because anybody can walk through and assault the things upon which this great country was founded. It's happening day after day after day because of the breach in the wall. They saw the importance of that, and with a singleness of heart and mind, they worked toward it. There's nothing as galvanizing as the power of purpose. Nehemiah 4:17 and 18. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand, held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. In other words, not even a physical threat would deter. You know, I hear that we have our enemies. That's okay. I've got a sword in this hand. I got a trowel in this hand. Hand me a brick. Well, maybe you better place the brick and I'll just use the trowel, you know. But that's how they work. That's how we're called to work as well. The sword of the Lord in our hands, the Word of God. Doing what He's called us to do. Nehemiah 6:3-4. I sent messengers to send out and Geshem with this reply. I'm carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you? 4 times they sent me the same message, and 4 times I gave them the same answer. Then this verse in 5:16, I devoted myself to the work on this wall. All my men were assembled there for the work, and we did not acquire any land. Just a moment of explanation there. What he meant was there were other governors before him that were sent to oversee what was going on, and they started taxing the people, and they started living large, and the project languished, and the people languished, and they were still impoverished, and a few of them were living really well. And Nehemiah saw that, and he called them to account, and he said, I didn't take a thing from them. I didn't even so much as take land, which I could have done. He said, my focus was not going to be distracted by the stuff that I accumulated. Selah. I was going to focus on what God had called me to do. Let me tell you, one of the reasons why we don't do the holy discontent thing well in this country is not just because we have insulated ourselves from everything uncomfortable, but because we have filled our lives with stuff. And everything that you acquire requires a part of you to maintain what you have acquired. Houses and lands and automobiles and dogs and cats and kittens and whatever it is. It requires your personal attention. And you look at your address or your calendar book and you're so filled up you don't have time for nothing. That's why holy discontents die on the vine, because God's people have filled their lives with stuff that doesn't make an eternal difference. Because that keeps them occupied so that the work of God languishes. It's a plan of the enemy. Nehemiah saw right through that, said, I don't need all that stuff. I love the fact that Bill Hybels, when he shares a part of his own personal story, he says that as the church started growing, and I was in St. Joe, Michigan from till about 92. We were there about 5 years, so about 86 to 92 was our tenure there. And I actually went around the tip of the lake. St. Joe is in the southwestern corner of Michigan. Went around the tip of the lake, went to South Barrington, Illinois, wanted to see firsthand the church. And we took some of our young people, and we actually went to a service there. And at that time, their annual budget was $8 million back then. $8 million. And so as, Bill Hybels got a lot of notoriety, as his book started selling, he got royalties. And as the eldership started blessing him in his work, because initially, for years, the handful of leaders in that church never even so much as got paid because there wasn't money there. They were selling tomatoes door to door just to fund some of their projects. They were committed to the vision. And then as the Lord started to multiply, and he started to, what he called in one time at a meeting with some pastors, he said, my life started acquiring some kush. I had some of the good things. And I started wanting more. And he said he felt God arresting him. And he went before his board of elders and he said, you know what, you guys need to cap my salary. Because if I keep going in this direction, it will ruin me. It's interesting, I think, because it has sustained his vision. The Willow Creek Community Church is still a vibrant church in that community, still transforming spiritual communities around the world because of the purpose-driven nature that Bill Hybels has and the holy discontent that drove him. Finally, discharge your holy discontent. It's the power of preservation. Nehemiah 13, 7 through 9. Here I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. You don't have this one, but I wanted to share it with you. Nehemiah leaves for a time. If you wind the clock forward, he gets things going, and then they celebrate. They celebrate some of the things that the law called for, festival of booths, and some of these things, that were a part and parcel of who they were as a people, part of the tapestry of their lives. And then he goes back. He can't leave the king forever. The king had given him permission to go, so he had to go back. And then he's gone for an interval, and he gets back, and things had started to disintegrate again. And a part of the disintegration was that Eliashib had moved Tobiah into the temple. Tobiah, you heard about him. That's one of the guys that was with Sam Mallet and the others that were trying to dissuade Nehemiah from doing anything good, from rallying the people of God, from building the city and the wall. He was the guy that persevered, that stood opposed to all of that. And here the priest moves him right into the temple. Nehemiah's response, I was greatly displeased. And threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I sprayed Lysol everywhere, and put back into them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense. And Nehemiah didn't play. He understood that in order for a holy discontent to continue, you got to preserve some things. Because the enemy is going to try to water it down, dilute it, distort it, distract it. He understood the power of preservation. It's important for us to maintain the vision. It's important for us to keep Yahweh first. And I am not moving Satan into the temple. Think about that for a moment. The enemy had been invited into the inner sanctums. sanctum. It's as though Satan had taken up residence in the sanctuary. And I thought to myself, oh man, I'd like to take that clock sometimes and just smash it because I don't have time to preach on that. But that'd be a sermon right there. Satan in the church. Sometimes through our actions and our attitudes, we pull up an office chair for Satan and put it right behind that altar and let him do his office work right here. Because we won't forgive that brother or sister because they really stepped on my nerves, and I am about to forgive them. I ain't going to do that. I don't agree with that project. They can go do that. Disrupts the unity of God's people. Talebearers, backstabbers, people who lie, people who compromise their lives on a personal level, and you don't think it makes a difference because we have a disassociation with the way what I do here on Sunday morning and what I do on Monday is different, but you're mistaken about that. Because if you let the enemy into your temple, that is, into your body, into your lifestyle, into your value system, you're bringing all that garbage in on Sunday morning, and Satan is in the church. And Nehemiah understood the importance of keeping that pure, and he was after that, and he took Tobiah and he threw him out of the temple, all the stuff with him, and said, you ain't welcome here. It's time the church did the same thing. I'm not going to let him influence me to disrupt the work of God because of my pettiness or my personal hang-ups or because of my personal limitations and weaknesses. And he's all over me, by the way. Another long story. To do that very thing because he knows where the chinks in my armor are. Nehemiah 13:20-21. Once or twice the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside of Jerusalem. You know why they're used to this? Because they had gotten used to doing business. The folks that had stayed in Jerusalem while Nehemiah had pulled out, they had economic liaisons that were healthy. And so they were invited to come on in. Come on, it's the Lord's Day, but we're going to buy and sell and make some money. But I warned them and said, why do you spend the night by the wall? Nehemiah, again, a little displeased, says, if you do this again, I'm going to put my hands on you. And from that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. They saw what he did to Tobiah, and they weren't about to allow him to do that to them. They had learned to thrive economically, but not spiritually. And because the church is affluent at times in America, we have learned to thrive economically, but we don't thrive spiritually. Nehemiah 13:25, he says, I rebuked them and called curses down on them. Who's them? The men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod and Ammon and Moab. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. And I beat some of the men and I pulled out their hair. What's wrong with you? I like the fact that right after he does that, he prays. Lord, remember me. What's wrong with the foreign women? Well, I learned that it's to a large extent it was the women that perpetuated the religious traditions of their time. The men went out to the fields. The men herded the flocks. The men gathered. The men went to war. So it was the women who perpetuated the religious traditions of their time. That's why, God loves all persons, or all peoples, does he not? When we read the Old Testament, we kind of disconnect from that. But the point was that Yahweh was using Israel to be a light to the nations. The problem is that they assimilated themselves with the customs of the nations and could no longer be salt, light, or leaven. That's why God's judgment fell on them to purify a remnant so that we can get back to the business of being salt, light, and leaven. And that's what all these stories are about. The problem is, when I read about the women of foreign countries, God ain't against foreign women. I mean, he wants all nations to come to him, don't he? Ruth is an exception to that story sometimes. But you see that the problem was, and it happened to Solomon too, the problem was that since you've heard the phrase, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. Very true. Because they influenced. And so they often weren't willing to give up They're liaisons to their deities. And so that made it into the households of the Israelites. And so Nehemiah said, I'm not going to have it. It's why this whole mess started in the first place. And he grabbed him by the hair and he said, stop doing that. And they listened. Nehemiah 13:28. One of the sons of Joiada, son of Eliashib the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite. And I drove him away from him. Nehemiah understood that you have to preserve that holy discontent. Keep it stoked. Don't compromise. Nehemiah 13:30 says, so I made the priests and the Levites clean and pure. I'm telling you, you cannot be the faithful steward of a holy discontent and live a life that is impure. There will come a point in time where God says, I can't use you because you're not pure. That's why it's important for us to cleanse the sanctuary, I'm talking personally and corporately, to allow God to have his way in my life. And not to disconnect and disassociate with what I do Sunday from what I do the rest of the week, but to understand that it's fully orbed, and as the temple of God, which is the person of God, comes together with other people of God, Sunday can rock because we are filled with His Spirit. A holy discontent can change the world. What's yours? Father, we thank you for your goodness and your grace and your glory. Lord, we have only begun to scratch the surface of what you're desirous of doing. And I'm asking you to just draw back the veil a little bit and help us to see, God. Help us to see. Because it's your desire for us to be change agents in this world for the glory of God. And to that end, sometimes you afflict us. God, help us to understand how important it is to identify our holy discontent, to feed it, to steward it, to stoke it, to share it with others, to protect and preserve it, and to see it through, lest we live this life in such a way that we leave this world and never make a difference. Capture our hearts, even as you are capturing mine. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Father God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time we've been able to have together. Lord, we thank you for your word proclaimed this morning. God, we ask that you would help us to persevere, to take risks, God, to find that holy discontent that you've given us and run with it, God, wherever you want us to go. God, I pray that we would not be content to settle for less than what you have for us as individuals, for us as a body. God, that we would strain, that we would push, that we would strive, God, for more of you in our lives and for more of your vision and your mission for our lives and this church and this community. God, help us not to settle. God, may we carry with us the word that's been spoken today. God, may we continue to process it and allow you, Father, through your Holy Spirit, to use it in our hearts and lives each day, that we may not only be transformed ourselves, but that through our transformation, that we would transform others through your Holy Spirit's power. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. You are dismissed.